Oh, yeah,
Oh,
excellent.
yeah, excellent.
I'm echoing. Why is that happening?
Because I have you open in a different window because I had the pregame show. I had, well, I was sorry, because I did the announcement today. And so I
Ah,
just had it open.
speaking of which, can you since I don't know what code you used, can you take us live on Facebook when we go live?
Yes,
Since I assume that's still open on your screen. Here's
sure
Alina
is.
Polyakova. All right. Let's.
Facebook goes live automatically as soon as the live is, it works, as soon as
No,
it
I
works.
disabled it.
Oh, well, it does
Oh,
now.
no. Uh, yeah,
It's been
it's
going
ready to.
live
It's
automatically on
not.
Facebook, not YouTube.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh,
Do you
okay.
want me to go? But do you want me to take us live on YouTube, or you can do
No, no,
that?
I got, I
Yeah.
got, I got YouTube covered. And as soon as Alina shows up on screen, we will go live. In fact, maybe we'll go live while Alina is showing up on screen. Um, let's do that actually. Um, and we're live! Exclamation mark. All right. Hello,
Can you
Hi.
Alina.
hear me?
Are you draped in an American flag?
I will have you know this is a fashion item. It is a scarf.
It's a
That is
fashion
awesome.
item. I love it.
But you are
I
not.
am
Are you in fact on a treadmill right
I
now?
am. I am on a treadmill right now.
That's super cool.
You're
Um,
on a treadmill and you're wearing a scarf and jewelry? Are you
Well,
actively using the treadmill?
I will be as soon as we
yeah.
get this going.
All right, let's get it going. And this is the first time we've
Why
ever
does
had a
everyone
guest
have cool
from
exercise things?
exercise equipment. It's awesome. All right, I'm going to click to take us live. Click. And
Wow.
we're live. It is Friday, June 4th, 2021, 5:02 p.m. Eastern Time, 1:02 p.m. a.m. Estonia time, I think. Maybe midnight Estonia time, I'm not sure. Um, Alina Polyakova is joining us from the treadmill because we are that kind of a show where we encourage that sort of thing. She is also decked out in a American flag shawl, showing the kind of patriotism that we expect of our guests because we call them great Americans at the end of the show. So
Exactly.
it's important to earn that. Um, we are not
Also,
allowed to
like, who
have fun.
looks like this when they exercise? Alina looks like this when she exercises.
Well, I've had a year to get used to walking on a treadmill for all of my Zoom calls.
That's kind of
I
it's an
I
amazing idea.
use now this has been a source of friction between me and some of the lawfare staff. I have an under the desk elliptical which I use during a lot of Zoom meetings, and a bunch of my staff really hate it, and they find it unnerving and
What, just the noise of it, or like that there's like,
no, the fact that my shoulders go like this.
oh
The
yeah.
the fact that I seem to be moving and yet am sitting still, people find it jarring, and I don't care. There are many ways in which I strive to make people not uncomfortable, but that's not one of them.
I'm
We are
going to get this. I'm going to get this wall art for you, Ben. This is what your under the desk elliptical reminds me of. I just put it in the chat.
Oh yes, people have sent me that after many a Zoom meeting, and I just want to say that is actually my life: retaining a surface calm while frantically paddling underneath.
Mm.
We are not allowed to have fun anymore, but I want to say we're having more fun than certain people in Belarus are being allowed to have. So, Alina, let's start there. What is the latest from Belarus?
Well, the timing of our not so fun conversation really couldn't be better or worse, depends on how you look at it. So there's some recent developments over the long, protracted, and now escalating mess that Lukashenko has caused with his plane hijacking and arrest of a journalist and his girlfriend who are on board. He's been in prison this entire time since the end of May 27th, I believe. And today there was a video confession, so-called confession, released by the government, where he admitted to planning a anti-government coup rebellion against Lukashenko, and showed remorse for all of his actions. And of course, the most gruesome part is there were many journalists noted that if you zoomed in on his hands, there were a lot of marks on his hands. It definitely looked like he had been tortured. At least that's what people allege and suspect. And obviously that's not outside the realm of possibilities, and very likely that's exactly what happened. And it was just a very depressing thing to see. And in response to that, the EU has now banned Belarus airlines from flying over all EU space. And many are pushing for sanctions at the G7 summit that's coming up in just a few less than 2 weeks here, actually. So that's what's going on in Belarus. And that is where we currently are.
So, where is who prohibited from flying now? For a while, the Russians were threatening to keep out of their airspace any planes that were not flying over Belarusian airspace. Has that materialized? Is there basically a I won't let you fly in mine if you don't fly in Lukashenko's kind of thing going on, or is that bluster on Putin's part?
So I have not seen the Russians make that official policy. There's certainly been, some statements around that, that, if you do this, we do that. But so far, I haven't seen anything. That doesn't mean it might not change in the next hour or less. But so far, it does seem like the Russians have decided to not get as deeply involved in this. After all, this is not, to their mind, really about Russia. It's about Belarus. And to a certain extent, the Russians have to be careful how they deal with Europe. Europe is still Russia's biggest export market when it comes to gas. And the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, we can get into that a little bit, but that comes into this calculation as well. I think, we are almost done, but we meaning Gazprom. I don't know why I said the we, but the Nord Stream 2 pipeline is 95% finished. It'll probably get finished for the next couple of weeks. The Biden administration hedged on really putting an end to it, probably to try to save the Germany relationship. And so the Russians want to be careful about how they approach Europe here. And I don't think they're willing to potentially ruin this really important project or cause any kind of economic pain to themselves. And they're not going to die on the Belarus sword, basically.
So, how does the new airplane no-fly policy differ from the one put in place by the EU immediately after the hijacking of the flight?
That's a great question. My understanding is that this was part of the initial plan already to institute this ban. I think it's a coincidence, from what I can tell, that it happened at the same time as we had this interview with the journalist published. But it was the ban that was initially previewed early, and it has now come into effect, is my understanding.
One more question before I let Kate take over. Why are we going ahead with this summit?
Your guess is as good as mine there. I've been a skeptic of the summit for a while, as you probably know. I don't really see a plan in place. I think the only thing I can imagine is maybe the administration has a bunch of deals they're hoping to make at the G7, all the summits previous, the G7 with NATO, where they're going to, maybe they'll find a way to have a great anti-kleptocracy, anti-illicit finance coalition is going to have some serious pain potentially for Russia and all the Russian oligarchs, including Mr. Putin. But I am very skeptical that is doable. Nothing has certainly been previewed that would be at that level of seriousness. So I don't know why we are having the summit at all.
Yeah. So how is this gonna, let's say the summit goes forward, but let's say that all of these bans on airspace continue. And how does this end? Like, does this end how does, what are the avenues for this to play out, basically? Like, one avenue is obviously that something drastic changes that seems incredibly unlikely, and they return, they release, I don't know how to say his last name, but they release the journalist back, and he's allowed to leave. Another is that he's disappeared or killed in some way, and this ban keeps going indefinitely. Another is the ban just kind of fades, they put a time, places put a time limit on it, or just this isn't as urgent a crisis anymore, and they, without announcing it, places just kind of lift the ban. What do you think the outcome is going to be?
It's hard to predict. And the journalist's name, yes, is a kind of difficult Russian name, sort of, Roman Prostasevich.
Thank you.
Yes. I think there's a short game here and there's a long game. I think in the short term, seems clear that Belarus is likely to just increasingly become a pariah state, even more so than it was before. I think, as we talked about before, I think last time I talked to you guys on Lawfare, there's the irony here is that for years, Lukashenko had been trying to play both sides. He'd been making some approaches to the West and to some extent the United States. The fact that we even have an ambassador to Belarus is a big deal. She's not there right now, as far as I know, but she's an ambassador to Belarus, and we haven't had that. Under the Obama administration, we started to see more dialogue, even at the military level, which was not something we did before. So there were good steps being taken to give Belarus a bit of an opening and say, we know you're bad, but if you're willing to make some concessions, there's a path here potentially, a very, very light touch. And now that seems to be completely closed off. I mean, completely. And so the only reality here is that Belarus just becomes a satellite state of Russia, I think, at this point. I mean, they have no one else to look to. And of course, the Belarusian people will suffer the most because it will have economic hardship, but they'll probably find ways to get their products exported to Europe in various other ways, workarounds, I'm sure, despite the sanctions. The Russians will help with that, undoubtedly. But I think the short term is that it's a closed state. I think in the longer term, whatever the longer term is, it almost becomes a satellite state of Russia. And for the Russians, this is great. They've been wanting this kind of commonwealth with Belarus forever, since Putin came to power. And there could not be a model. Right, and there could not be a model where eventually this goes on this path, Putin becomes the, overlord of some sort of Russian commonwealth, and they have, presidents in Russia, president in Belarus, Lukashenko or not, but Putin gets to elevate himself, which is, of course, what he wants. He's not really happy just being president of Russia anymore, I think. He wants higher status, he wants higher standing. I think the things could shift, but it's really hard to see how the Belarusian opposition that is in exile. And we have to remember, Roman was also in exile. He was not living in Belarus anymore. And this was clearly a message to everyone else in Lithuania or elsewhere that, you're not safe. We'll get you one way or another. And I just don't see how the opposition at this point has any real influence inside the country.
And so I guess I want to come back to Kate's question then, which is, all right, so if the answer is what happens now is, well, Putin kind of wins, what policy levers do we or the EU have to interrupt that as an outcome?
It's hard to think of what we have beyond sanctions. And I think in many ways, sanctions, because the Russians will help Belarus, because they're very good at this by now, get around any potential sanctions in various ways. It's just a really bad situation in which we really don't have much leverage. I think it's just going to remain this black hole in Europe. I mean, there's a possibility, I think, in which Lukashenko dies, and then that leads to even a more terrible outcome, potentially, where Russia just wholeheartedly takes over the country. That's an option. Or maybe that provides a moment of opportunity for the opposition to revive itself.
So if I were Vladimir Putin and my eyes were on the near abroad with the covetous eye of the, I don't want to restore the Soviet Union, but I sure would want to restore the Tsarist Empire, which is, as a landmass similar. You look at the Baltics and you say, well, okay, I got a NATO problem there, so I'll menace them, but there's a limit to what I'll do. But there are these other countries that are, more like Belarus than they are like Estonia, right? Kazakhstan, right? Uh, Kyrgyzstan. These, they're fairly large. They're governed by strongmen. They're pretty dependent on Russia as a on a day-to-day level. Um, sh- why shouldn't I be worried that if Putin gets away with this with Belarus, um, you know, Armenia is next?
That's a great question. So if we look at the entire kind of Russia's perceived sphere of influence, which is basically the post-Soviet space, minus the Baltics, because, the Russians let them go into NATO, right, from their
The
perspective.
Baltics are special.
Right. It was a great, in the Russian psyche, the official psyche, that was like one of the greatest mistakes after the fall of the Soviet Union was to let the Baltics join NATO, let them join it. I mean, they didn't have much leverage there at the time. And the Kremlin under Putin has been very consistent in its policy that never again. And they've had actually quite successful approach to maintaining that buffer between themselves and NATO on the one hand, as well as ensuring commitment from Central Asia to Russia because the governments there are friendly, although that's changing too. But let me put Central Asia in a slightly different category because the dynamic there has China involved, which makes things a bit more complicated, a little different than the European, so the Western border of Russia. And your question about, is this really about sending a message? I think Crimea and the annexation of Crimea, 100%. You think you can go this route towards democracy, what have you, maybe even NATO, or maybe just signing an EU trade agreement. Well, think again, because we're just going to bite off a piece of your territory and then forget about it. We have to remember that in Armenia and the Caucasus, they have the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict there, which allows them to maintain a lot of leverage in the region. So I think they think that's fine. And there's been a lot of recent developments that I don't want to get too into it, but I think the Russians actually did very well for themselves in ensuring that they have a foothold and that Armenia doesn't stray. And Azerbaijan will remain, friendly because strongman, oil state, things like that. But certainly, we look at this belt of the former Eastern Bloc states are not in NATO, and they're between Russia and NATO. They all have these so-called frozen conflicts in them. And Belarus, in a way, has been a kind of an outlier, because it doesn't have Russian-controlled territory on its border, but it was a pretty good deal. The Russians didn't have to go and militarily expend any resources. They had a friendly government there, Lukashenko. They basically had completely infiltrated or never separated, I should say, the security services. So they had complete knowledge of everything that was happening. Huge amount of leverage. They weren't happy about what Lukashenko's doing. And I think, with Belarus in Russia's orbit, they've just sealed the deal on this entire buffer zone, from the Caucasus, Moldova to Ukraine, and now Belarus.
So if it's okay, I'm going to actually share a map.
Yes, a map is great.
Yeah, because I'm actually looking at it right now. And because I was like, when I was reading about everything that's happening in Belarus while I was on vacation, I was like trying to kind of put in my mind what all the very literal geopolitical politics are, like the fact of where these things are geographically and what they're next to, influencing the politics that plays out on the ground. And so obviously you're kind of speaking where this is Belarus over here. So the interesting thing, as you kind of just mentioned, and you can obviously see on the map, and it's good to kind of see the visual reminder of it, is that it's insulated from most of Western Europe by Poland and Ukraine. Obviously, I'm a Moldovan, Romania, but it's pretty well insulated. And the Balkans, the Balkan states, which already have this kind of, as you said, Baltics, sorry, that deal with. I know this is new to me, Ben. So I'm this is not my area of expertise at all, even a tiny little bit. So I'm very naive in this, but a lot of it is kind of common sense. So some of it is common sense, especially when it comes to kind of the alignment of the geopolitics. So it makes perfect sense to me that when you went over to Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan, and you have China, what is right off the map over here, obviously, is China is right here in the lower right, is that then it becomes a war with China versus a war with Western Europe.
Correct. That's exactly right. I'm going to say something and put a link in the chat for everyone, which is a map I find helpful. It is a map of the actual so-called frozen conflicts in the region. So it gives people a real clear view that these are not separate conflicts from the Kremlin's perspective.
I'll pull it up on the screen.
Yes, there has been a strategic approach here over many, many years.
And walk us through that strategic approach. What unites these little areas that constitute these frozen conflicts, and why is it in Russia's advantage? Most of them, but not all of them, are ethnic Russian. What value strategically do they serve for Russia to have these frozen conflicts?
Well, before we get there, one thing I'll say is that I think we should have some sort of bonus prize for someone that can, without cheating, name all of these frozen conflicts.
I bet you Ben can do it. No? Really?
No. Well, so I can. Number 7 is Nagorno-Karabakh. 6 and 5 are the Ossetias, or one of them is North Ossetia, and the other is
close.
Sorry. Okay.
Abkhazia and South Ossetia.
Abkhazia and South Ossetia. 4 is going to be Transnistria, right?
Yes.
3 is the Crimea.
Yes.
Um,
Wow.
2 and 1 are the eastern regions of Ukraine that are currently occupied by little green men. The names
Bonus
of
points if you know the region names.
I cannot give you the region names.
Ben, I'm so impressed.
That's very good though. It's
I
Luhansk and Donetsk.
Oh, sorry, I should have known that. But I'm annoyed at myself that I couldn't remember South Ossetia and Abkhazia.
I like literally don't know if I've ever heard those words before.
Well,
That's
there
how
you
much
I
this
was
go.
is
proud
not
of
my.
myself for getting Transdnistria.
Yeah, also
Um,
that, which I thought you maybe made up, but yes.
well, it's on the other side of the Dniester River.
Oh, well, then that makes sense.
Nice.
So,
Nice.
what unites these conflicts? Um,
Um, well, look, I mean, from this map, I think one very obvious thing is Belarus doesn't have one of these, so-called gray zones. I mean, a little gray on the map, which is why it labeled as gray zones, but not a big fan of that name for a variety of reasons. But Belarus is the outlier here. And if we look at the border, the Russian border, historically, even to the days of the Russian Empire, it has, and this is still the same, and it was the same during the Soviet days, and it's the same today. Moscow has sought to keep a buffer zone between itself and either other empires, or then, after the Second World War, Europe, and then NATO. And it has done so in various ways, primarily through direct territorial occupation, full out occupation. That was the Soviet case. During the Russian Empire, that was also the case. But Russia, much diminished in its ability to maintain occupation of large areas, like Ukraine, which is a huge country, or Belarus, which is also a large country. They succumbed to this strategy of ensuring that they have this so-called buffer zone between themselves and, in this case, it's NATO and Europe, which they see as adversarial to Russia. And that's where you see these kinds of frozen conflicts, why you see them where they are. It's been many years, and it's also some that Putin himself has orchestrated this situation we find ourselves now. And it also sends a message to any other that wants to stray too far. We know how to deal with you. You think you can get out. All we have to do is, send in some mercenaries, and that's it for you. The West won't touch you. And so they've
This map
used
is
the
amazing.
Yeah, it's very useful. I've used it in a couple of lectures here and there. Can't take credit for it, obviously. Didn't make it, but it's super useful just to give you a sense of how the world looks from Moscow. And then I think Central Asia, if you look at, the stans, which aren't fully featured on this map, we don't have the same situation there, because interestingly, just as for centuries, Moscow has looked west to identify its enemies, it continues to do so now. So the border with Russia and China is incredibly porous, shockingly so. Obviously, Central Asia is a core region of competition for the two countries. And interestingly enough, the Russians have effectively let the Chinese do whatever they want.
and why is that? Why do the Russians, if I were Putin, I would be pretty afraid of China, because for somewhat the same reason that the Indians are very concerned about China. They have a huge land border. They are with China. They are out. The Chinese are outperforming the Russians economically by gargantuan margins across every known indicator. Um, their their interests are not necessarily congruent, except in the sense of both wanting to fuck us. So why are relations they're so good, and why are the friction points so successfully muted?
Well, this really gets us into kind of a raging debate that's been going on for some years among the Russian nerds, I should say, about the real nature of the Russia-China relationship. I think and whether this is a real alliance that's deeper than it looks, or whether it's really just superficial, and as you said, Ben, they really kind of united by the anti-task of anti-West, anti-US hegemony. But if you go beyond that, there's not much really holding their relationship together. You will find people arguing from both sides, and I think there's evidence for both. Certainly on military cooperation, we've seen a huge uptick in Russian-Chinese military cooperation, sharing of technologies, and the Russians are assisting the Chinese with their missile defense system, which is huge because that's technology that the Russians still had some comparative advantage in. They're providing other kinds of expertise, technical expertise from your scientists and physicists, things of that nature. And the Chinese are getting a lot from the relationship with Russia. They're getting a lot of natural resources. I always bring this example that a lot of the logging that happens in Russia's Far East, which is very rich in all kinds of natural extractive resources, the Chinese are cutting down Russian forests and then selling the wood to the West as Chinese, which I find incredible. So that being said, why has this been a lot to go on? Well, I think the writing has been clear for Putin for a very long time, that the rising power is China. It's not the United States. That if you're with China, you can, sort of ride the coattails probably for a while. And I think people underestimate how much of this is short-term thinking. And what I mean by that, obviously, is a realization that China can outcompete Russia, basically almost everything. There's very few areas in weapons, in some technologies, that Russians still have a leg up. But that window is closing. And so they still have some opportunity here to sell some things, lay some gas pipelines, down into China, to really benefit financially and to hedge against any punitive damages or consequences they might get for whatever the hell they're doing in the West.
That's interesting.
But, at some point, something will give. We don't know if that's going to be now or in 10 years or in 5 years. But historically speaking, the Russians have never been happy playing second fiddle. They weren't happy doing that to the United States. They weren't happy doing that to any empire. And there's a lot of animosity on a cultural level between people, racism being a big part of it too. And there's not, so it's hard to see this really being a real long-term alliance. But I may eat my words, because maybe the desire to screw the West is so deep they'll hold them together.
I also just have a hard time believing that two massive countries with that long a land border don't have conflict over the long run.
Yeah.
It's maybe growing up playing Risk as much as I did, but
but I literally don't start a land war in Asia.
I really just it took Stalin and Mao. I guess it took until shortly after Stalin's death and barely 10 years after the People's Republic is formed for those countries to become mortal enemies. Authoritarians don't tend to get along for very long periods of time. Their alliances tend to be tactical. And I just don't believe that that Putin and Xi Jinping are going to live in harmony for the long run.
Right. I tend to be in the skeptical camp, but you'll definitely find opinions very much in the opposite direction.
Genevieve Della Fera, you get the first question today.
Hello.
Hi, everybody. So my question is, I believe that Putin signed a law today banning extremists from running for elected office. To what extent is this targeted specifically at Navalny and his supporters, or does it amount to a total limitation of true political competition, because then the state could designate anyone as an extremist prior to an election?
Ah, man, this is a great question. If I'm not mistaken, I think he may have signed the law yesterday, but I may be wrong about that. This week, let's just say that this happened. We anticipate this happening. The Russian Parliament, the Duma, rubber stamped it a while ago. I will just say one thing. Yes, it is aimed at Navalny and his supporters, who have been labeled as an extremist organization, which in Russian terminology, it's calling an organization a terrorist cell. So it's the same classification that the Russian state would give to ISIS, for example. And so at that point, any organization or individual labeled as an extremist basically is seen as a national security threat. It's gloves are off. They can do whatever they want. They can throw people in jail with fake trials, what have you, with no fake trials anymore. They can raid their offices, confiscate everything, which they've been doing to all of Navalny's offices around the country for the last months anyways. But basically, they're untouchable at this point. Anybody associated with Navalny's anti-corruption group is completely untouchable. Bank accounts, you can't open bank accounts. It's like very real life kind of stuff. So yes, it's part of completely just wiping out whatever is left of Navalny's operation, and that is priority number one. But this extremist law has been on the books and other various forms of it, like foreign agent law and undesirable law, for years. It really started very, very early on in Putin's terms. Like around 2005 was when we started getting this stuff on the books. And they've been revising, making them stricter and stricter until now we finally get to this point where, if you're extremist, you're untouchable, you can be thrown in jail, you can be there forever, you can go to the labor camps, and there's really no trial, whatever a trial means in Russia these days, which is all sham. Bank accounts frozen, the whole shebang. So I think what this means for any Russian opposition is that, it basically becomes an underground movement, if anything.
The estimable ducks with pants.
Oh, Tom.
I called on ducks with pants, and Tom McGuckin showed up. We'll get to Tom McGuckin, but for right now,
McGuckin ducks.
you're both regulars.
Autocorrect.
The floor is yours.
I have been auto-corrected to Tom McGuckin. I don't know. So obviously Putin has no intentions of going anywhere, but he is still just one guy, and things can happen. Photo op on the horse that gets spooked, treadmill that suddenly goes haywire, that sort of thing. What is a post-Putin?
I just want to say, if he fought me, things would be more likely to go awry. I'm just saying his handlers have been wise to refuse my challenge.
No argument there. Anyway, given the current state of play, what would a post-Putin Russia potentially look like, given succession crises, and also how much do we put on Putin too much as far as Russia's general stance in the world and how they operate? Is it really just the psyche of one ex-KGB guy from East Germany, or is this, what we'd expect from any given leadership in Russia at this point?
Well, those are tough questions. On the post-Putin Russia, again, this is one of favorite parlor game among Russian nerds across the world. What happens exactly after this?
No, I said after risk.
After risk. I was going to say after in lieu of fun, but
yeah.
There's a lot of different scenarios there that people have been trying to think through. for years now, because Putin's been in power for over 20 years. So at some point, something has to give. And I think there's a scenario in which it gets much worse, and we have someone who's far more violent and more brutal than Putin, because in some ways, he hasn't been as violent as he could be. I'm not saying he hasn't been violent, but it could get a lot worse.
He hasn't been randomly violent.
Correct. They haven't, turned the guns on random protesters, and even when they were repressing the most recent Navalny protests. It was brutal, but they didn't just indiscriminately fire on people like a Tiananmen-style scenario. Someone else could do that, frankly. So, Putin disappears, some bloodthirsty egomaniac comes to power, rules by force. That could be a scenario. Another one could be, Putin chooses a handpicked successor that he sort of shadow trains as the chancellor of Belarus and Russia. And he has his president that he tests out, who's kind of a no-name like he was. There's possibly other scenarios there as well. I think it's hard to see a scenario in which, we have a democratic revolution in Russia anytime soon, because the state has done such a great job wiping out any sort of opposition. But hey, you never know.
Birthday today.
It is.
Doesn't seem appropriate to sing happy birthday.
No, it doesn't. But I'm just saying.
Christopher, sorry.
If I can add one thing on Russian birthday songs, somebody on the chat said this is a super depressing episode. Well, welcome to my everyday.
This isn't even that bad compared to most of our episodes, I would say. We've had way more depressing episodes than you, Alina.
Oh, good. Thank you. I'm glad to hear it. I will say that the so-called Russian birthday song, there really isn't one. But the only one that comes close to it is deeply depressing. And it's all about, I will send it in the chat, because if you want to watch it, it's a cartoon. It's all about how it's raining and I'm depressed, but hey, it's my birthday, so I'm going to play my, what is that thing called?
Accordion?
Accordion. Yeah. And just watch people walk by and not notice me.
Excellent.
Oh, really? That's how it ends?
Yeah.
Oh, good.
All right, Christopher Argyris, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ben, for rescuing me. I think I accidentally hit like the trackpad, and so I exited the screen, and then you brought me back in. But thank you.
Brought you back.
Thank you. So you've already covered sort of the ill-advised rationale for hosting a summit with Putin at this time, but I sort of want to sort of flip it on its from Putin's perspective. And I'm certainly not a criminologist or anything like that, but I would think that he's got his MO is basically he wants to restore like the sort of Russian Empire, Soviet Union, like, and put himself, as a world superpower, and then on equal footing with the United States. And at the same time, he wants to undermine like the Western democratic order that the U.S. sort of represents the leadership of. And so, if you're meeting with him, it could be seen. Some leaders that we have, we want to bring them into the tent and meet with them to sort of normalize relations. And other leaders, by meeting with them, we give them legitimacy or a power sort of that they can say, look, I'm on equal terms here with the U.S. president. So in this case, I would think it's more the latter. What do you think is sort of Putin's strategy going into this meeting? I know with Obama, stuff like that, he's sort of famous for giving long lectures, and I'm sure that he will talk to Biden and say, like, how dare you ask, tell me to reform, and he'll bring up George Floyd, and he'll bring up the January 6th insurrection, and sort of all these sort of things that he tells to Russians, saying like, you guys may want, a Western style democracy, but look how bad they have it. So you're better off with me. So is that kind of like how you see him kind of in private with the world leader like Biden to be like, don't tell me what to do. You guys don't have it so great yourself.
Well, that's a great question. I think, how many presidents has Putin gone through at this point? I think the lesson that he has taken is, regardless of party, all U.S. presidents are the same. And he's approached them, meaning, they say they want a better relationship, but nothing ever changes. This is the Russian view, I should say. So I don't anticipate the Russian approach to the summit being any different than what we saw with Trump or what we saw with Obama. Now, the Russians are famous for being very well prepared. I'll give you one example, which was the huge embarrassment suffered by basically the EU's foreign minister, Josep Borrell, where at the press conference, Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, announced, I think, sanctions on European officials, and Borrell just had no idea and just kind of stood there like a frozen fish and had nothing to say about it. It was incredible, and the Russians obviously planned all this out. I don't anticipate something like that happening because this is an important moment for them from a PR perspective. Putin likes nothing more than the U.S. President Putin, same table, making deals. But what do I expect publicly? The blame narrative, which we've heard many times before, the whataboutism that was being mentioned. Well, what about you? Yeah, you blame us for this, but what about that? It's a constant strategy. In private, Biden and Putin have met before. Obviously not at the same level. They know each other. I'm assuming people like Tory and Newland will be there. I'm assuming. And there's going to be some familiar faces. What are they going to really talk about in private? I don't think it's going to be much more productive than what we're going to see in public, to be honest.
Tom McGuckin.
Tom!
It's so good to see you guys. You're my
Miss
friends.
you.
Okay. Any rate, listen, my question concerns the cyber ransom. I'm almost calling this like a beginning of a proxy war. And I really like this Fred Kaplan, and he wrote a book called Dark Territories about 5 or 6 years ago, where he said this thing can really escalate into, mutual assured destruction, almost that level of, think about wiping out Bank of America, all their accounts or something like that. And so I guess what I'm getting at is what's your take on Putin's strategy? I saw your little southern border strategy. That was very interesting. But I'm just asking, he seems to be using his little mob friends to sort of be fighting a war on the side of the economics here. And I just wanted to get your comment about that.
I mean, I think that's very, very on point, to be honest. We've seen now several attacks on U.S. critical infrastructure by criminal groups in Russia. And I think we tend to say, in the American mindset, well, sure, there's criminal groups, but it's not the Russian government. And of course, it isn't. But when we look at the Russian doctrine of warfare and how it's developed over time, and how Russia has been very effective at using proxies, exactly as Chris said, in all kinds of kinetic and non-kinetic ways. And the reality is that there's not a coincidence here that these groups are based in Russia. And the reason for that, of course, is that there's a very intimate relationship between criminal hackers and the Russian security services. They will often recruit from these organizations. They will work directly with them. Yes, Nicole Perloff has a great book. It's very depressing. If anybody wants something even more depressing in this discussion. And so the idea that we can
on to talk about it. That's why I said there have been more depressing people than you.
Very good. Yeah, she's fantastic. But look, I mean, she's right. And I think when it comes to the reality, I don't know how it's not getting through that we're under attack, as Americans. We couldn't get gas.
Yeah, I just want to add something to this because I agree with everything you just said, Alina, but I think there's another element to it as well, which is these ransomware attacks have two separate value propositions, I think, from the Russian government's point of view. One is they demonstrate America's cybersecurity weakness. And therefore, they show in an ongoing way that, the beef industry is, the Russians can cut off our food, right? They can cut off our fuel. And so there's a sort of ongoing demonstration that we can't protect, whether you call it critical infrastructure or just important industries, right? But the second thing is, to the extent that these cases get resolved as they do by companies paying the ransom, this is the Russian government taxing U.S. industry.
Yes.
And we actually don't assess it that way, but we should. We should say, like,
I love that. You should write an op-ed about that. Like, just literally saying that as the headline.
I don't have more to say about it than
but that's
that
all. I mean, like, most op-eds don't, Ben. I don't know if you've read them lately.
And to the extent we allow it to happen over time, we are just allowing Russian taxation of U.S. domestic product. And I think that is a scandalous thing for American politicians to permit. Just saying. Jared.
I love that take.
I agree. And that's a very interesting take on it, Ben.
I really think that it would be all you'd have to do is give a summary of like Colonial Pipeline, then a summary of the beef industry thing, and then like
the city of Baltimore.
And the city of Baltimore, and then show that everyone paid ransom, and then show that like where it is that these are coming from, and that would be like literally 1,000 words, and you could write it up. It would be a great op-ed. Yeah. I love that.
There's no way the Kremlin is not getting a cut.
Yeah,
right.
There's no way.
And also, but even if they weren't, the fact that it involves an ongoing wealth transfer from U.S. industry to Russia, and at a time when we are freezing. There are all kinds of frozen assets, and there's,
and it's being enabled by Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. And I mean, I think it aligns. Anyway, sorry, I don't. You of all people know how to write a fucking op-ed, but like, I'm just going to say that I think it's I haven't heard that before, and I think it's a really smart take.
Jared, you are a black rectangle, but your mic is on and the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you, Ben. My question is about the economic underpinning of Russia. They say they want to be a world power, but they seem pretty heavily basing their economy on oil and gas. So is it even possible to achieve their goal under those conditions?
I think the short answer to that is no. I mean, Russia is not an economic superpower by any means, and their economy is highly dependent on extractive industries of all kinds. So oil and gas being the dominant, but things like metals, chemicals, ore of various kinds, agriculture, not production, but like literally the kind of precursor elements, grain, all these kinds of things. They're kind of an industrial economy trying to be a post-industrial superpower. And that is already outdated. And all their attempts to jumpstart a kind of Russian Silicon Valley or to try to replicate what China is able to do with massive government investment, they just haven't been able to get it off the ground for a variety of reasons. So it's really hard to see any dynamism in the Russian economic model through for a very long time. And I have to give the Russian central bank and their minister of finance a lot of credit for actually being to mitigate very effectively the sanctions effects. While not going into debt, they've maintained, their sovereign wealth fund. And by the way, they're dumping US dollars now right before the summit. What kind of message is that sending? Like, we want a partnership with you? No, they're saying there's nothing here in the long term. Exactly, Kate.
I'm really good at giving the camera the finger, like at the exact right moment.
Drew Rickett. You are not even a black rectangle. You are just invisible, but we should be able to hear you.
Good. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Hello.
Happy Friday, everyone. How does the alignment of Belarus with Russia impact Ukraine-Russia tensions now that fully 2/3 of Ukraine's land borders are with Russia or her allies?
Well, let's just say I don't think it presents a significant change in my view, because but it's not that things have significantly changed in Belarus. Belarus has always been a Russian ally. And if things had turned the democratic direction and then flipped back to, an authoritarian state, then we could talk about what that means. But frankly, I don't think this changes much for the Ukrainians. It compromises them more potentially if there is greater, as I've been suggesting, potentially greater integration at the military level, especially, and at this intelligence agency level between Belarus and Russia. Because of exactly the reasons you mentioned, because just the porous borders. But for Ukraine, I don't think it changes much, except increases their vulnerability, which for the Russian perspective is great. They want Ukraine to be deeply vulnerable and very unattractive to any foreign investment or Western companies or countries.
Michael Nelson, who doesn't seem to be available to come on screen, asks, we hear a lot about Russian influence operations using Twitter and Facebook, but a lot of potential targets are not online. How successful have Russians been at spreading disinformation on TV and radio, especially in Ukraine, the Baltics, and elsewhere in Eastern Europe?
Specifically TV, radio, not online platforms. This we could have a whole show about. Well, one, in Ukraine, there were Russian language channels, viewed directly from Russia on Ukrainian TVs. The Ukrainian government very controversially basically banned those some years ago, but there was a lot of ethnic and linguistic anger over it. But they did it because they saw as a national security threat that a country that has invaded them is allowed to pump as much state-controlled media into Ukraine as they want. That being said, if you have a satellite, which a lot of people do, you can still get whatever you want. In the Baltic states, there are Russian language channels, but again, people have to access those, and the Russian-speaking diaspora, especially in Latvia and Estonia, are very vulnerable to Russian language radio. I don't know as much about, but certainly television, and especially of the older generation, because these are people who weren't born in independent Estonia or Latvia. But I know we do have Thomas Ilves. I don't know if he's still around. He would know a lot more about this than I do, being the former president of Estonia. But I know he may have dropped out because it's pretty late over there in Estonia these days.
He seems to be still here. But we are basically out of time, so I will remember to ask him that question the next time we are together. Matteo, you get the last question today.
Thanks, Ben.
Walking through the trees.
Nice.
Walking through the trees. Yeah, no,
So
it's a nice
both
day.
walking.
You and Alina are both walking.
I should have that tree background is what I should do.
Yeah, you should have like a background that.
Yes, you should have it.
moves.
Things that looks like you're just walking through the trees somewhere.
Exactly.
That's not some type of creepy virtual reality, like future or something.
Wait, is that not a real background?
Wait,
This is my real background, as you can see by my printer.
Oh, you treadmill. I got it.
A topic of much discussion in the chat.
It would be cool,
I lost
Alina, if you
connection. I was
had
in
like
the underground
a
for a
fake
bit.
background that was exactly the same
Yeah,
as your
it was
real
just like
background.
that typical. I know.
So it was like nobody could tell if it was your fake background or real.
Love it.
What's on your mind, Matteo?
Not much. I'm enjoying the beautiful DC weather. But I forgot my question. I had two.
The first one.
The first one. So how relevant to what's going on now is Alexander Dugin's Foundations of Geopolitics to Putin's strategy? I've only read a few summaries that I could find and some sections that were translated for, I think, a UCLA thesis, but it seems to map remarkably well onto the actual actions that we're seeing. And so I'm curious if you had any insight as to if that's an actively used text.
Look, there are a lot of people who give a lot of weight to Dugin. I'm a Dugin skeptic. And if you talk to most Russians, they're also Dugin skeptics. He's been one of these kind of fringe thinkers in Russian political thought and more geopolitical thought that was kind of pulled out from the darkness and then raised to be this sort of Rasputin, the modern Rasputin of Putin. I never realized those kind of rhymed. Anyways, but I tend to be a skeptic about his actual influence. I think what we've seen Putin develop is a worldview that draws on a lot of different ideas. And certainly some of Dugin's ideas are part of that. But it's not this overarching ideology as being driven by this one person, meaning Dugin. So I think Putinism, if we want to think of this collection of ideas about Russian national belonging, Russian foreign policy, all those things, Russia's vision of itself, draws on a lot of different things. Dugin is probably a part of it. How much, I can't tell you anymore, but I tend to be, from everything I've read, everyone I've talked to, very much skeptical that he himself and his ideas remain influential in the Kremlin today.
I think that when you really scratch the surface of what Putin believes, his worldview is just simple great Russian nationalism and nothing else. It's like he's basically, if you take the anti-Bolshevik white Russian, sort of czarist, and you remove the monarchism from it and just replace it with basic, Salazar authoritarianism of a very kind of mid-century variety. I don't see how Putin differs from that at all.
Right. Right. And I think Putin also fancies himself, based on the palace that Navalny revealed he's building, very much, that's his, summer home, just like Peter the Great had his summer home. That's his summer home because he's the czar and that's what he deserves. There's no question that he sees himself in that light.
And I gotta say, I see myself in that light too. I think we should all have a summer palace like that. And I'm totally sympathetic with the idea that, you should have a summer palace like that and keep it secret, because what's the point of having a palace like that to flaunt unless you keep it secret? It makes no sense to me.
Then anytime you invite someone over, you can say, do you want to come to my secret palace, instead of just saying palace, because that's boring.
Right. It's boring.
Right.
I think
because you already have so many of those that everyone knows about.
Given Navalny a tour of it, I can't imagine why you would have a place like that except to show off your wealth. We are going to leave it there. I have an important announcement to make, which is that I'm announcing the name of our mystery guest on Sunday, because a lot of you have wanted to hear from her. And so I don't want to have Deirdre Connolly on the show and not announce it, because, then some of you might just think, we're going to have Taylor Swift on, or, sort of one of our normal mystery guests. I want you to know in advance. So we are going to treat Sunday's mystery guest as a regular show. Deirdre Connolly, who I think is in the audience today, will be joining us. Alina Polyakova, you're a great American and were even before you donned that scarf. How many miles did this show take you?
You know, I only walk at 1.5 miles speed, so 1.56 miles.
Okay, so now we can say exactly how long In Lieu of Fun is. It is
We should give people a
1.6
distance when
miles.
they agree to do the show. We should be
Yeah,
like, it's an hour or 1.5 miles.
we measure in lieu of fun, not in length of time, but in actual distance. Thank you for joining us.
Thank
We
you.
will be back 22 hours and 55 minutes from now. It'll be a Just Us Saturday with Kate and me and Scott Shapiro. Good Shabbos, everybody, and we will see you tomorrow. See you
Shabbat
soon.